Tuesday, Antarctica. Six Soviet explorers set out to chart one of the last untouched corners of the planet, venturing thousands of kilometers to reach the South Pole through regions no human had ever seen. A land so remote, so brutal, that most who tried before either failed or never came back. Yet for some reason, these guys seemed eager to go. Turns out, this time the Soviets had something the others didn't, a brand new, untested colossal machine built just 3 months prior. And they also had some, just in case, designed to sustain the team as they lived, worked, and slept in isolation for an entire year. It was their only hope of survival in the White Desert. This is Kharkovchanka, an Antarctic off-road behemoth 8.5 meters long, 3.5 meters wide, and 4 meters high, built to defy Antarctica's brutality and destined to become one of history's greatest engineering legends. To understand what the heck these guys are doing here with this crazy machine, we first need to go back and see where this machine came from. In the 1930s and 1940s, numerous countries raced to re-establish a presence in Antarctica, particularly to reach the geographical South Pole. This journey was harsh and deadly, with temperatures dropping below -80 degrees Celsius, winds reaching 300 kilometers per hour, and ice sheets over 2 kilometers thick. These extreme conditions created an environment unfit for human life. However, beneath the frozen landscape lay the potential for enormous riches, including oil and mineral reserves. Despite this, the Soviets remained uninterested in Antarctica until the 1950s. In contrast, the United States took action in 1939 when President Franklin D. Roosevelt launched the U.S. Antarctic Service Expedition. This mission required significant equipment to reach the South Pole and other unknown regions. One of their solutions was the Antarctic Snow Cruiser, a vehicle unlike anything built before. The Snow Cruiser was the size of a small building and could carry 5 explorers, allowing them to sleep and work on board. However, once the Snow Cruiser was landed on the coast of Antarctica, the machine, built to conquer the icy terrain, failed miserably. It was underpowered, and its smooth tires spun hopelessly in the snow. The vehicle only tested on highways, encountered snow for the first time, and could not move an inch. Ultimately, the Snow Cruiser was abandoned, disappeared beneath the snow, and has been lost ever since.
I feel like any tire tread pattern would have given better traction than what they went with. Like this one.
So, no need for tracks?
Well, if they put tracks on it, weight would have been an even bigger issue since it already had a pretty bad power-to-weight ratio. At least from what I read on Wiki. Alright, let's hear what the Soviets did differently. Go on.
In 1955, the US finally reached the South Pole during Operation Deep Freeze, using aircraft. However, one significant challenge remained: reaching the pole of inaccessibility, which is even more difficult and deadly than the South Pole. The Americans did not have a machine powerful enough to reach the southern pole of inaccessibility, the point on the Antarctic continent that is the furthest from the ocean in all directions. The Soviet Union was the first to reach this remote location in 1958, using a machine so well built and designed that it remained functional even 50 years later. Before reaching the southern pole of inaccessibility, the Soviets built 2 key Antarctic bases. The first, Mirny Station, was established in February 1956 on the coast. From there, they started constructing Vostok Station, located 1,400 kilometers inland, which was completed by December 1957. What's wild is that the Soviets didn't even have fancy, specialized Antarctic machine like other countries. Instead, they rolled in with what they had: some ATT military tracked trucks and a few regular trucks. That's it. No high-tech snow machines, no custom-built vehicles. But somehow, they made it work and set the stage for some serious exploration down there. Moving further inland from the second station, Vostok was a whole new level of brutal. The conditions were insane: hurricane-force winds, blinding snowstorms that could bury a regular tractor in minutes, and temperatures plummeting below -70 degrees Celsius. These kinds of extremes froze components and fuel solid. On top of that, the terrain got tougher as they climbed higher, over 3 kilometers above sea level. The thin air at those altitudes led to oxygen starvation.
Damn, those altitudes were like 2/3 of what aviation rules say you need oxygen for in a visual flight rule aircraft. The atmospheric pressure is half of normal, and these guys were in a freaking tank with a truck cabin. Can you believe that? Oh my god.
Гусеницы забиты снегом. Надо немного раскачать. Давай расчистим перед... Антон, садись за руль! Плавно нажми на газ, аккуратно.
Понял. Готовы?
Пошло! Держи, держи!
At this point, it was clear that the ATT tractors weren't cutting it anymore. It was time to bring in something bigger, stronger, and specifically designed for these unforgiving Antarctic conditions. In 1957, the leadership of the Soviet Arctic Institute approached the government with a bold request. They needed a new, groundbreaking vehicle for Antarctic exploration. The mission was clear. The vehicle had to have a solid platform, a powerful engine, and a design that included living accommodations with top-notch insulation to protect the crew from the harsh Antarctic conditions. The Soviet government handed the massive project to the Kharkov heavy tractor and machine plant in the Ukrainian city of Kharkov. Their task? To create a one-of-a-kind vehicle that had never been seen before. And they were given just 3 months to design and produce it. The result was a massive vehicle, 8.5 meters long, 3.5 meters wide, and 4 meters high. Let's see the interior. At the front, there was a cockpit designed for 4 crew members with a driver's seat, controls, engine access, and a glass dome for taking meteorological readings and positioning. It didn't have radar, and the radio contact was minimal. The windshield was double glazed with heating elements to prevent snow buildup, something unheard of in most vehicles at the time. From the cockpit, you could access the rear accommodation through highly insulated layers. The rear was divided into several rooms. The main compartment with a table, chairs, and sleeping bunks for 6 people. Next to it, a radio room. Followed by a kitchen. At the back of the cabin was an airplane-style toilet, followed by an equipment room and a secondary exit. The middle row rooms were heated by a wall-mounted heater powered by the onboard generators. The engine of the new vehicle was almost identical to the ATT tractor, but with significant upgrades. It featured a 5-speed gearbox and was powered by a 12-cylinder diesel engine that included twin-turbine superchargers. This setup gave the vehicle an impressive 900 horsepower, nearly double the power of the original ATT. The engine bay was cleverly placed inside the accommodation shell, which was inspired by the original American snow cruiser. This setup allowed the crew to work and operate the vehicle without needing to leave the comfort of the interior. As a result, the vehicle could reach speeds of up to 35 miles per hour, despite weighing a hefty 35 metric tons. It was also capable of towing an impressive 60 tons, but unfortunately, the engine was so loud it made sleeping difficult and covered everything in soot.
Sounds very Soviet. Some impressively clever solutions here and there, but a few choices that make the whole thing almost unusable for people.
There's a Russian saying, "Любишь кататься, люби и саночки возить." I mean, this was a Soviet vehicle, so it wasn't exactly built for luxury or comfort, or even...
Might make sense.
With a 2,500-liter fuel tank, the vehicle could travel up to 1,500 kilometers on a full tank, which was essential for the long and difficult journeys across the Antarctic landscape. In early 1958, the Kharkovchanka was delivered to Mirny Station. From there, it began its legendary journey. First traveling to Vostok Station, and then onwards to the Pole of Inaccessibility, which lay 600 kilometers from Vostok and 878 kilometers from the South Pole. The trip was anything but smooth. Around the 500-kilometer mark, the team encountered significant problems. 160 track pins broke, fuel consumption shot up to 9.6 to 12 liters per kilometer, and the average speed dropped to 4.6 to 6 kilometers per hour. To make matters worse, one of the three Kharkovchankas suffered a gearbox failure. Fixing the gearbox was no small feat. It weighed a hefty 600 kilograms. The crew had to remove it by lifting it from the top of the machine and replacing it with a spare. This grueling task took 5 days in minus 55 degrees Celsius temperatures, with winds constantly battering them. Despite these intense challenges, the Soviet team persevered and made history by reaching the pole of inaccessibility on December 14, 1958. When the Soviets arrived, they quickly set up a temporary research building. To top it off, they placed a hut, and on top of that, they mounted a plastic bust of Lenin, strategically positioned to face north, so Lenin could symbolically look toward Moscow. Initially, the plan was for the team to stay there for 6 months, and they had brought enough food and fuel to last that long. But the conditions were so extreme, unbearably cold and inhospitable, that they had to abandon the site after just 12 days. After wrapping up their trek to the pole of inaccessibility, the Soviets headed back to Vostok Station.
Man, the more I think about it, the more I see how Antarctic exploration is basically like space travel.
Yeah, same with deep sea stuff.
For real, they all have that same feel, just a tiny piece of human civilization in the middle of nowhere.
Fast forward to December 1959, they geared up for their next big adventure, this time to the South Pole. Early one morning, the team at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, the American base, spotted something unusual on the horizon. Emerging out of the bright white Antarctic landscape was a convoy of 3 Kharkovchankas. These machines, which had only rolled off the production line a few months earlier, were practically untested. Yet here they were, making history by conquering both the pole of inaccessibility and the geographical South Pole within a year. Safe to say, the Americans were probably a bit surprised by the arrival of these Soviet giants in the middle of nowhere.
I think I get the idea. Soviets focused on simple, robust, and practical designs rather than just high-tech solutions. They built things crude and basic, so they'd break down sooner than their Western counterparts.
Yeah, like comparing a Lada to an Audi.
Exactly, but when they did break, they were ridiculously easy to fix, and you'd be back on your way. Take the Kharkovchanka's track pins, for example. Instead of redesigning the whole track, they just welded a steel block at an angle to knock the pin back into place as vehicle moved.
The Kharkovchanka went on to complete dozens of exploration missions, connecting Soviet stations and reaching deep into the unexplored inner regions of Antarctica. By 1975, the Soviets unveiled the second-generation Kharkovchanka. This version was redesigned with a front-mounted engine, a bonnet, and a cab layout that made accessing the engine bay way easier. It was an upgrade that turned an already legendary vehicle into something even more reliable and comfortable. This successor was also deployed to Antarctica, and both generations of the Kharkovchanka served on the icy continent for decades. They were so well built that they stayed operational until 2010, a full 50 years after the original Kharkovchanka began its historic journeys. Today, one of the first-generation Kharkovchankas is proudly parked at Progress Station, standing as a monument to this incredible series of vehicles. It's joined by an ATT tractor preserved at the Vostok Historical Site, a nod to the earlier attempts at Antarctic exploration. The first-generation Kharkovchanka, with its unique design, holds immense historical and emotional value for the Soviets, who still visit these machines in Antarctica. Meanwhile, the second-generation Kharkovchankas? They're still rolling strong, proving their worth on the unforgiving Antarctic ice. In 1964, the Americans visited the abandoned research station at the pole of inaccessibility. They stayed for over a month, and during that time, decided to reposition Lenin's bust so it faced Washington, D.C. instead of Moscow. Later, in 1967, the Soviets returned briefly, turned Lenin's bust back to face Moscow, and then completely abandoned the station for good. For 40 years, no one set foot at the pole of inaccessibility. But in 2007, a British expedition finally made it back there. When they arrived, they found that the research station had been buried by decades of snowfall, but remarkably, Lenin's bust, now at the highest point of the structure, had survived and was still in decent shape. In a bit of a cheeky moment, the team joked about turning Lenin's bust to face London. The last humans to visit the site were in 2011, and by then, the bust was still standing strong.